right, y'all, it's time for us to start our Sunday morning worship service. We always start off with announcements. The first announcement that I have, Sister Nancy's back. She's still healing from her facelift, but other than that, you're looking good, Nancy. We're real proud. I know Riley's proud, so glad to see you back, Nancy. Pat, I haven't heard anything on Pat, so I take it that she's doing pretty well. And Randy as well was having problems with his back, sciatica and things of that nature. And I think he had fallen once or twice. I know he had fell once, but I haven't heard anything out of them, so I take it no change is better than a change for the worse. So we'll just put it like that. Mike Butts is doing well. You'll remember that a week or two ago he had eye surgery, and he has come out on the bright side of his eye surgery. But just going to let the congregation know that Mike is going to be attending North Street periodically for the majority of the time because of his grandkids. He's looking for somewhere where they can be more involved with youth and be surrounded by kids their age. So, understandably so, Mike's looking out for his grandkids. So we probably will not be seeing a lot of Mike as he's looking out for his grandchildren. Let's see here. Chick and Dorothy Sparks. I think we're all aware of the situation surrounding them not doing well at all. You may have to correct me, but I think Chick is already back and Dorothy's coming home today. Coming home tomorrow. And hospice has been called in on both of them. So, not doing well at all. Marilyn Wright's been cooking with her daughter and her husband. They have food prepared. And so she has brought it to my attention if anybody wants to make any donations, paper plates, plastic silverware, things of that nature, or if you just want to take food as well, that she's going to be doing that. So I think I'm going to take a look in the back. I know I keep plastic silverware on hand at my house. I don't like doing dishes, so I know I'll contribute a little bit to that as well. Teresa Wilson, Sister Jane's niece, back in the hospital. So continue to pray for Teresa and her family. I have one more. Mary Stallings having bypass surgery Wednesday, right? Okay. So Mary Stallings been on the prayer list for a while. Finally got a date for her surgery. So that's going to be Wednesday. So continue to pray for Mary, James, and Jennifer, and all of them. And then last but certainly not least, Buddy is asking for donations. He's got an extra mouth to feed this week, and so he's really worried about his pocketbook. So, and then we got some visitors back here in the back. Melinda's got her son and his wife, and their two good-looking kids back there. So make sure y'all shake. Is it Nathan? Okay. So I'm glad I didn't make the mistake and call you by your brother's name. So score brownie points there, I guess. So y'all make sure y'all meet Nathan and his wife. And then Adam, right? He's visiting with us this morning as well. So we got a couple of visitors. So, and James, you're not a visitor. So it's good to see you back anyway. So with that being said, we always provide the opportunity at the end of services to make any announcements we forgot to make. But with that being said, Brother Buddy, I turn it over to you, sir.
I was going to tell Marilyn there are plates and silverware.
Okay, so
I'll get
some today.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, no problem. Let's start out with 348. We'll sing 1, 2, and 4. 348. Jesus is all the world to me, my life, my joy, my own. He is my strength from day to day. Without him 454. 454. What can wash away my sin? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. What can make me whole again? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Oh, precious is the flow that makes me white as snow. No other fount I know. Nothing but the blood of Jesus. For my part of this I see. Nothing but the blood of Jesus. For my cleansing this my plea. Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Oh, precious is the flow that makes me white as snow. No other fount I know. Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Nothing can for sin atone. Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Not a good that I have done. Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Oh, precious is the flow that makes me white as snow. No other fount I know. Nothing but the blood of Jesus.
Our most gracious Heavenly Father, we come before you this morning to give you thanks for this bread, as we partake in memory of thy Son, Jesus' body. In Christ's name we do pray. Our most gracious Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for this fruit of the vine, as we partake in memory of thy Son Jesus' shed blood on the cross, that we might have forgiveness of sin. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
to worship you. We pray at this time we give back a portion to continue your work here and elsewhere. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
421. 421. I was sinking deep in sin, far from the peaceful shore, very deeply stained within, sinking to rise no more. But the master of the sea heard my despairing cry, from the waters lifted me, now safe am I. Love lifted me, love lifted me, when nothing else will help. Love lifted me, love lifted me, love lifted me, when nothing else will help. Love lifted me. All my heart to him I give, ever to him I cling. In his blessed presence live, ever his praises sing. Love so mighty and so true, merits my soul's best songs. Faithful, loving service to him belong. Love lifted me, love lifted me, when nothing else will lift. Love lifted me, love lifted me, love lifted me, when nothing else would help. Love lifted me. Souls in danger, look above. Jesus completely saved. He will lift you by his love out of the angry waves. He's the master of the sea, will of his will obey. He, your Savior, wants to be saved today. Love lifted me, love lifted me, when nothing else could help. Love lifted me, love lifted me, love lifted me, when nothing else could help. Love lifted me. Let's all be standing for an opening prayer, and when Brother Wesley finishes, we'll sing 456. 456.
Would y'all bow with me? Father, our God in heaven, we thank you for another wonderful day of life, dear God. We thank you for another wonderful opportunity that we as men and women of like mind and like faith counted as a wonderful privilege to be able to gather together here together in this assembly to worship you in spirit and in truth. We hope we have been doing that very thing, dear God. lifting up our voices in song, we have remembered your Son and the sacrifice that he made by partaking of the Lord's Supper. We petition you in prayer, dear God, and here in just a moment we are going to open up our Bibles and study another portion of your word. And it is always our prayer, dear God, that we be receptive to the things that we study this morning, that we open up our hearts to the message, that we take it, that we apply it to our lives, that we may continue to live in such a manner that is pleasing in your sight. Father, we thank you for being our creator and our sustainer. We thank you for everything that you do on our behalf, for all the things that you do for us, both physically and spiritually, dear God. We recognize your hand. We recognize your hand in our daily lives, and we pray that you just continue to have mercy and love for us, and that you continue to bless us as you see fit. Father, we have a number of those who are on our hearts and our minds at this time, dear God. Whether their ailments be physical or spiritual in nature, dear God, we just pray that you lay a hand of healing, that lay a hand of comfort and strength upon these individuals who are on our hearts and our minds, that you just that you take note of their individual need, and we just pray that you do something for them, dear God. At this time, dear God, we just want to express our heartfelt gratitude for the sending of your Son, that he came to this earth, that he died a cruel death upon that cruel cross of Calvary, that we as sinners might have hope of eternal life. And it is our prayer, dear God, that we continue to live in such a way that brings glory and honor to his name, that we continue to run our race with all faith, with all perseverance, with all patience, that when the time comes that we stand before you at the day of judgment, that we can stand before you with our head held high and hear those words, well done, good and faithful servant. All these things we ask in your Son's name. Amen.
456. No tears in heaven, no sorrows given, all will be glory in that land. There'll be no sadness, all will be gladness, when we shall join that happy band. No tears in heaven fair, no tears up there, sorrow and pain will all have flown. No tears in heaven fair, no tears up there, no tears in heaven will be known. Glory is waiting up yonder, where we shall spend an endless day. There with our Savior will be forever, where no more sorrow can dismay. No tears, no tears up there, sorrow and pain will all have flown. No tears in heaven fair, no tears up there, no tears in heaven will be known. Some morning yonder we'll cease to ponder o'er things was brought to view. All will be clearer, loved ones be dearer, in heaven's we're all new. No tears in heaven's fair, no tears up there, sorrow and pain will all have flown. No tears in heaven fair, no tears up there, no tears in heaven will be known. Please be seated. The invitation song will be 4:15, and we'll turn it over to Brother Wesley.
want everybody to grab their Bibles with me this morning, and we're going to be in Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3. It's good to see everyone here this morning. I always look forward to the opportunity that we have together to gather together on the first day of the week and to open up God's Word together and study another portion from it. And I have told you once before, and I guess I'm just going to have to tell you again, that most oftentimes in my lessons and in my preaching, we are all seasoned veterans in the church, so to speak. We do not have many young people in our congregation, and so most of the time I try to center my preaching around things that apply to us who have already been living the Christian life for some length of time. And most oftentimes my lessons and my teachings and my preachings have to do with the concept of Christian living. We have already obeyed the gospel. We have already taken that pledge of faith, and we have already been growing as New Testament Christians. And so I just seek for us to continue to add to our repertoire, so to speak, for us to continue to grow, for us to continue to learn, so that we can continue to walk the straight and narrow path and continue to live a life that is pleasing unto God. And this is exactly the same type of mindset and attitude that the Apostle Paul has, simply because when we come to passages like Colossians chapter 3, we read where the Apostle Paul also teaches and preaches and writes on such subjects. In Colossians chapter 3, in the very first verse, we've read it many a times over my span of time here with you at Appleby, and we're going to read it again. The Apostle Paul says, "If then you are raised with Christ," he's talking about a person who was lowered down into the watery grave of baptism and raised to walk in newness of life. You are raised with Christ. He's talking to New Testament Christians. He says, "Seek those things which are above, where Christ is sitting at the right hand of God." And it is from this beginning statement that the Apostle Paul begins in verse 2 through about verse 10 or verse 11 here, so to speak, that the Apostle Paul begins to talk about the opposite of what a New Testament Christian is supposed to set their sights on and what a New Testament Christian is supposed to chase after. He says here in verse 2, he has just got through saying in verse 1 that we are to seek those things which are above, but here he begins the opposite here in verse 2, where he says, "Set your mind on things above, not on things of the earth." And one of the reasons why the Apostle Paul would call for us to be heavenly minded and not earthly minded is because what? He begins to list behaviors that are earthly, that we are to not associate with. Verse 5, "Put to death the members which are on the earth, fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, covetousness, which is idolatry." And the reason why the Apostle Paul says that is because he says here in verse 6, "Because of these things the wrath of God is coming upon the sons of disobedience." And so the Apostle Paul is not trying to be mean. He's not saying this with malice or with evil intent, but rather the intent upon the heart of the Apostle Paul that says, "I am identifying for you which that God does not associate with, that he doesn't like, that he wants nothing to do with," because the Apostle Paul says, "I do not want you to be alienated from God. I want you to have a relationship with God. I want you to be a receiver of the blessings of God." And so this is why when we drop our eyes down to verse 12, after the Apostle Paul has finished his discussion about the earthly things and how we are to separate ourselves from them, then the Apostle Paul begins the real discussion beginning in verse 12 as to what we as New Testament Christians are to associate with. What are we to practice? What are we to be setting our minds on? What are some of the motivating factors that are supposed to be motivating us when we go out and we have interactions with different people? Why do I treat people the way that I do? How am I supposed to treat people? And the Apostle Paul gives us a very wonderful discourse here, beginning in verse 12. We're going to go through verse 13. Not verse 13. That's not much of a sermon there. Verse 12 through verse 17 are the passages that we're going to look at here this morning. And we can just appreciate that the Apostle Paul offers us some wonderful insights, some wonderful guidelines in regards to how we can live lives that are pleasing to God. So just some very basic instruction for the New Testament Christian. And this is where we begin in verse 12, where the Apostle Paul says, "Therefore, as the elect of God." Once again, I've already made the statement, I've already made the point, but I'm going to make it again here because he reiterates himself in verse 12, a point that he has already made in verse 1, and that is the Apostle Paul is not talking to people outside the church, but rather he's talking to people who are already New Testament Christians. The Apostle Paul is talking to men and women who are in the very same exact position that we are in today here in the 21st century. He's talking to people in the first century who are striving to do the same thing that we are striving to do on a day-to-day basis, and that is to simply live the Christian life. Guess what? The people in the first century, they were human beings just like we are. They had moments of weakness. They had moments of doubt. They had moments of discouragement. The Apostle Paul recognizes that, and that's why we have this word of encouragement from the Apostle Paul here to the church at Colossae. And how wonderful it is that we as New Testament Christians here in the 21st century can open up our Bibles and we can read the same words of encouragement that the Apostle Paul had to offer in the first century. We can glean the same encouragement there that was offered in the first century here today in the 21st century. And so that is why I like to call our attention to such passages. So continuing on in verse 12, "Therefore as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, and long-suffering." I want you to appreciate that the Apostle Paul wastes no time in identifying for the New Testament Christian just what types of behavior God finds acceptable in His sight. And we can appreciate the simplicity. We can appreciate the simplicity that the Apostle Paul speaks with here in verse 12. In that he tells us exactly, number one, he tells us exactly what we need to do. Okay, what does he tell us what we need to do? He says you need to put on. Some of your translations might say that you need to clothe yourselves with such of these things. What do you think that means for us to clothe ourselves or for us to put on? Well, that means to be in practice, something that we are to be engaged in. If we clothe ourselves wear it, what does that mean? We wear it. And if you wear something, guess what you do? You take it with you. You take it with you everywhere you go. Okay? Yesterday, me and my father went to the movie theater yesterday to see a movie. And I get cold because I usually get an icy when I go to the movie theater. And you know they keep it pretty cold in there anyways. And after I drink that icy, I'm freezing. Okay? And I grabbed my jacket and I brought it with me, and I told myself I'm not going to put it on until I get to the movie theater because guess what? It's hot outside, okay? And I got to the movie theater and I didn't have my jacket. It wasn't in my truck. It wasn't on me. I didn't put it on. And I was kind of ticked off that I didn't have my jacket because I was going to be in here with my shirt, with my arms in my shirt the whole length of the movie, okay? And you know what? And if I'd have gone ahead and put that jacket on, guess what? I'd have had it with me when I went in the movie theater. And so, very corny illustration. I don't care. I'm going to use it. I'm going to be proud of it. The illustration is that if I'd have put my jacket on, I'd have had it with me. The Apostle Paul says, clothe yourself with such things. Why? Because if you clothe yourselves, if you wear it, if you gird yourself with it, then guess what? It's always going to be with you. It's always going to be something that you're always going to be engaging in. And so we see the wisdom on behalf of the Apostle Paul and the language that he uses. So the first thing he has told us to do in verse 12, he's told us what we need to do. We need to put on, we need to clothe ourselves. And then the second thing he tells us is he tells us exactly what we need to be wearing. We need to be practicing. And he lists it for us. Tender mercies, okay? Tender mercies is also can be described as compassion. Tenderness expressed towards suffering, okay? That's a very basic, fundamental description I can give you of tender mercies. We see somebody in need. We see somebody suffering. Guess what? We reach out to help the individual. That's what it means to have compassion, okay? Not only tender mercies, but kindness, okay? A sweetness of disposition. not being mean, not being filled with malice, not being hurtful to other individuals, but what? Being nice, being kind, a sweetness of disposition. Humility. What does it mean to have humility? To be humble, to think lower of oneself, to not exalt yourself, but rather to have a humbleness of disposition. Meekness. Meekness is also described as gentleness, to be gentle. Okay? And then also the last thing that he says here is for us to also have long suffering. And that is self-restraint to bear injury or insult. Okay? So when we have long suffering, it is also described as patience. But also it means that we don't get upset at the drop of a hat, but rather we exercise patience, we exercise long suffering, and we allow ourselves to take a hit, so to speak, in order to not get upset and to keep the peace, so to speak. And so very fundamental things that the Apostle Paul calls for us to engage in here in verse 12. And he continues on in verse 13. Bearing with one another and forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so you must also do. And so, once again, the last thing that he calls for us to do in verse 12 is for us to be long-suffering, for us to engage in patience. And he tells us exactly what patience entails. He gives us a wonderful description here in verse 13. Bearing with one another and forgiving one another. Willingness to bear with those whose faults are irritating to them. Okay? And then the second thing is forgiving those that they have grievances against. That you have something against somebody, but ultimately you put that aside and you continue to have fellowship with one another. And I think the Apostle Paul couldn't have done a better job by which he gives us the ultimate prime example as to what it means to be long-suffering and to have patience. And that is the example of Jesus Christ. And also the concept of forgiveness, because he talks about forgiveness here in verse 13 as well. You go back up to Colossians chapter 2 and look at verse 13. Okay, look at the example that Christ has left for us to follow. And you being dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he has made alive together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses, having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us, and he has taken it out of the way and nailed it to the cross. Another wonderful passage is found in Romans chapter 5 and verse 8. If I can find it, I'd read it for you. Romans chapter 5 and verse 8. But God demonstrates his own love towards us, and that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. We were the guilty party. We were the ones that sinned against God. God was not in the wrong. We were the ones that were in the wrong. And yet God has demonstrated love. He has demonstrated patience. He has demonstrated the ultimate example of forgiveness, in that while we were in the wrong, God forgave us anyway. And he sent his son so that we might have remission of our sins and we might have a relationship with God. That is the ultimate example that we have as New Testament Christians to follow in regards to this concept as to what the Apostle Paul is talking about in regards to forgiveness and patience, that these are characteristics that we as New Testament Christians are to have as well. And I tell you what, brethren, Mama always told me, if you make fun of somebody, make fun of yourself. And I will be the first to admit that patience is one of the hardest things to practice and to practice consistently. Okay? In my job, I work in a construction type job, a construction type setting, and you better believe that in that line of work, there is not a lot of people that have patience. And I'll tell you what, there have been many a times that I've had to bite my tongue. Bite down on it hard, brethren, I'm telling you, till it's bleeding. In order for me to keep a cool head and for me to continue to act like a New Testament Christian. because I've already told you. They know me as preacher out there. They know I'm a preacher. And so guess what? They view me in a different light. They hold me to a higher standard. Okay? Because I'm a New Testament Christian. I'm a preacher. And so therefore I gotta live up to that standard. But I don't try to live up to that standard because people at work hold me to that standard. You know why I try to live up to that standard? Because that's the standard that God holds me to. And that is my motivation for me and acting and behaving the way that I do. Okay? And guess what? I'm not perfect. Sometimes the tongue slips out from between the teeth, and I do get upset, and I do lose patience. But you know what? All the Apostle Paul is asking for is the continual effort. The continual effort to grow, the continual effort to do better, to realize you make mistakes, learn from your mistakes, and to do what? To continue to grow as New Testament Christians. Verse 14, he says, "But above all these things, put on love, which is the bond of perfection." And once again, we had the example of Christ. For God so loved the world that he did what? He gave us his only begotten Son. The Bible describes true love for God on our behalf. In 1 John chapter 5 and verse 3, love is described as what? "For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments." 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 14, the Apostle Paul, once again, giving instruction, tells us that we are to do everything in love. God has demonstrated that love is selfless, that love takes into consideration the needs of others and not your own wants and not your own desires and not what it's going to cost you. Okay, that's what Christ has demonstrated by the example of love that he has given us. And then also John has told us that love for God is simple compliance with his commandments. Simple obedience. That's all we have to do. And look at what he tells us. Look at what the Apostle Paul reveals to us in the latter part of verse 14. If we engage in love, the Apostle Paul says that the result of engaging in love is the bond of perfection. 1 John chapter 1 and verse 7, John says, "If we walk in the light as he is in the light," okay, that's our obedience. That's what love for God is. If we walk in the light as he is in the light, watch this, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Christ cleanses us from all sin. The bond that the Apostle Paul is talking about in verse 14 is the fellowship that we have with God when we are obedient to him. And then the bond of perfection. Perfection is a result of what? The continual cleansing of the blood of Christ. Such a beautiful sentiment that is set forth by John and also the Apostle Paul. And then he says here in verse 15, "Let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to which also you were called in one body, and be thankful." And so here in verse 15, we have the Apostle Paul making reference to peace. What peace is he talking about? Well, he's talking about peace that is produced by the gospel and peace that is produced by our obedience to God's divine will. Peace with our fellow man. You go back to verse 14. The Apostle Paul says, "Above all things we are to engage in love." And let's also say that we engage in the things that are talked about in verses 12 and verse 13. We are allowing our lives to be led by the gospel. And this is going to produce peace with our fellow man. Why? Because I'm patient, I'm long-suffering, I'm gentle, I'm kind, I'm forgiving, and I'm expressing love towards my fellow man. Do you see how the gospel produces peace in the lives of New Testament Christians? Not only does it produce peace with our fellow man, but it produces peace from a good conscience. We have a good conscience because we know we are doing what is right in the eyes of God. We have peace from being in a right relationship with God. And then also we have peace from the idea of death. We understand that if we are faithful to the end, just like we were looking at in 2 Timothy this morning, where the Apostle Paul says that I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. And then he goes on to say in verse 8 that I'm going to receive a crown of righteousness. The idea of death, the Apostle Paul was staring death in the face. did not bother the Apostle Paul. Why? Because the Apostle Paul knew that he handled his business. He was faithful to God, and therefore he was not worried about losing his life. Because the Apostle Paul knew that he was going to spend eternity with God in heaven. Such a beautiful concept that is set forth by the Apostle Paul. John chapter 14 and verse 27, Jesus makes a statement that I think is appropriate for this occasion. John chapter 14 and verse 27, he says, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid." And so this is what the Apostle Paul is talking about, where he says, let the peace of God rule in your hearts, the peace that is brought about as a result of the gospel, produced by the gospel. Verse 16, he says, "Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord." And so we look here at verse 16, and we're going to call our attention to the very first thing that the Apostle Paul says, where he says, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. And so what the Apostle Paul is setting forth here in verse 16 is he's saying that when we submit to the demands of the Christian message, and we let it become so deeply implanted in us that it controls our every walk of life. It controls our every daily action. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. That all the direction that God gives to us upon the pages of the Bible, we open up our heart to it, and we let it be a lamp unto our feet as we continue to strive to walk the straight and narrow path. That is all the Apostle Paul is calling for here in verse 16. For us to be receptive to the instruction that we have upon the pages of the Bible, and for us to let it lead us to everlasting life with God in heaven. And there is a way to do that, the Apostle Paul says. He gives us an example here in the latter part of verse 16, where he says that we can teach and admonish one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. And so not only are when we sing, not only are we making use of every wisdom, that we are using them for teaching and admonishing and correcting and encouraging one another, but when we sing, we can also appreciate that singing is an avenue in which we can actually express real emotion when we are offering worship to God, and that we are encouraging one another. And then the last passage we had, I've tried to get there as quick as I can, brethren. I know you don't believe it, but I have. We are finally here at the last verse this morning, and that is verse 17. And the Apostle Paul tells us, "Whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him." And so this is a wonderful culminating statement made by the Apostle Paul when we're talking about Christian living, because basically what the Apostle Paul says in verse 17 is that he says, whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of Lord Jesus. We do not do anything without the authority, without God's authority. If we do not find authority for something upon the pages of the Bible, guess what? We as New Testament Christians don't do it. We don't take part in it. And that's exactly what the Apostle Paul is calling for. That we do everything by Christ's authority, that we are representatives of God, that we are representatives of Christ. We wear the name Christ. We are Christians. And because we are God's representatives, we should behave, we should act, we should live in such a way that brings glory and honor to the name of God. And the best way to begin to do that is by only doing what God has authorized for us to do upon the pages of the Bible. And so the Apostle Paul, just like the sentiment that the Apostle Paul has here in Colossians chapter 3, it is my same goal, it is my same frame of mind, that all I wanted to do this morning was that I wish to build you up, I wish to exhort you, and I wish to encourage you to continue to put your best foot forward as we all strive to live the Christian life, and we all are striving to receive that reward that awaits the faithful at the end of the way. And that's exactly where we were at in our studies this morning in the book of 2 Timothy. The Apostle Paul knows that the time of his departure is at hand. He knows that he's going to be put to death. He's in prison. He's in Rome. And yet the Apostle Paul was not depressed. He was not afraid to die. But rather the Apostle Paul was sort of melancholy. He was sort of at peace with the fact that he was going to die. You know why? Because the Apostle Paul says that I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. And I am going to receive the crown of righteousness that awaits the faithful at the end of the day. And I want us to have that same peace of mind. That's why I encourage you to live the Christian life. I continue to call our attention to these wonderful, encouraging verses that are found here in such epistles like the book of Colossians. As always, we extend the invitation. If there's anyone here this morning who has a spiritual need that they wish to bring before the congregation, make that need known and be assisted in that regard. We have men that are ready and willing to assist you in any way that we can. All you have to do is come forward, make that need known as we stand and as we sing.
4:15, let's sing 1 and 4 of 4:15. More about Jesus would I know, more of his grace to others show, more of his saving fullness see, more of his love who died for me. More about Jesus, more about Jesus, more of his saving fullness see, more of his love who died for me. More about Jesus on his throne, riches and glory all his own, more is his kingdom sure increase, more of his coming Prince of Peace. More about Jesus, more about Jesus, more of his saving fullness see, more of his love who died for me. Good lesson, Brother Wesley. Brother Peyton, if you will dismiss us.
Adam, glad you were here with us
Yes,
this
sir.
morning. Yes, sir.